And now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Courtney Cook. Courtney Cook is the author and illustrator of the graphic memoir, The Way She Feels, My Life on the Borderline in Pictures and Pieces, Tin House 2021. Hailed in a starred review from Kirkus as a funny, heartfelt guide to borderline personality disorder and a distillation of adolescent tortures many readers will recognize, The Way She Feels has received praise from the literary and mental health communities alike, including being named a Book Riot Best Book of the Year and featured by McLean Hospital. Her work has appeared in outlets such as The Guardian, Time, The Rumpus, Lunch Ticket, and elsewhere online. Courtney received her BA from the University of Michigan and MFA from the University of California, Riverside. She lives in Chicago and teaches creative writing from her living room with the help of her senior cat, Birdie. Courtney, take it away.
Hi, it is so nice to be here today, and I'm really unbelievably grateful to be able to speak to a community that's obviously so near and dear to my heart. As you know, I am the author of the graphic memoir, The Way She Feels, My Life on the Borderline in Pictures and Pieces. And I will speak more to my book later, but first I wanted to talk about my journey to diagnosis and how I ended up where I am today, which is a really good place to be, but it didn't feel like that for many years. So I grew up in a small village 16 miles north of Chicago called Winnetka, and Winnetka is the type of town you might expect to see in movies, and you have in Home Alone, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 16 Candles, just to name a few. And this is to say that I grew up in a picture, or should I don't know, say movie-esque town, and I had what many people would consider to be an idyllic childhood. When I was young, my mom worked from home, and she somehow found a way to make every day feel like an adventure and like we played together all day long, despite her having millions of things to do. My dad worked in the city, and he went into the office early enough that he could come home and help coach soccer or whatever sport that I disliked but tolerated for snacks at practice or halftime in games. My sister was always around to annoy me or play with me depending on the day, and we had a very dopey and like the cutest golden retriever of all time. And it seemed like, things were good, but mental illness doesn't care where you live or what you have. It doesn't have any regard for what you should feel theoretically. It just does its thing. And for me, it has always been there. I joke that I came out of the womb a sentient ball of anxiety because I don't think that I can remember a time where the world didn't feel like an overwhelming and scary place to be. As a child, I told my family and everyone that would listen that everything was too much. I said that the grass was too grassy and the sand was too sandy, and I just felt like raw and exposed all the time. I cried whenever I found a stranded earthworm on the sidewalk, and admittedly, I would still pick them up and put them back in the grass, but I no longer cry. And I once made my mom hug every tree in a large park in town because it had snowed and I were worried they were cold. My mom liked to call me a turtle without a shell. She said that I felt things so strongly, it was as if I didn't have the protection from the world that most others do. And I just had always felt that way, so I assumed everyone felt that way, and if they didn't, that I just did. And that was just me, I didn't know there was anything that I could feel like differently or better. But when I was in the 3rd grade, I started feeling what I can now recognize as depression, or perhaps my first BPD episode. But I didn't have the words for what I was feeling. I just knew something wasn't right. But what did that mean? I was 9. Everything around me was going well. I felt like if I couldn't point to anything and be like, yes, this is what's wrong, that I didn't even consider I was sad. I just was like, nothing. And they felt like a lot of times maybe I wasn't being truthful, and they would ask me and ask me and ask me, and I'd keep saying nothing. And then I'd finally say, oh, I have a stomach ache, I have a headache. Or I'd make up something. I'd say that someone was mean to me on the playground or something, because it was easier to have a reason. And as I entered middle school, these feelings just continued to grow, and my self-esteem dwindled because of it. I felt this very awful and strange hollowness inside me all the time. Like I was a black hole or something, and like just like nothing that existed just like sucked in, and I was sad. I didn't know why I felt this way, and I was so frustrated thinking like I have everything a person could need to feel happy, and yet like I'm not. And I thought that I was the problem then, that I was ungrateful for the amazing things in my life, that I was an awful person, that I was like a monster for feeling bad. And so I just kept my feelings to myself, and I found ways to cope that helped in the short term, but they did not in the long term, like self-harm. And despite my best attempts at hiding my feelings or trying not to feel them in the first place, it was obvious that I was unhappy, but I didn't want to be ungrateful. I didn't want to seem unappreciative. I knew I was lucky, and it didn't make sense to me to know that people said they loved me, but I couldn't feel it. It felt wrong. So I just fake a smile and assure people I was fine whenever they asked. But in March of 2009, when I was in the 7th grade, things grew to a point where I couldn't convince myself or anyone else that asked that I wasn't struggling. And I was admitted as an inpatient at a local psychiatric hospital. As I was describing to the doctors how I felt, I ended up being diagnosed with major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. And the doctors explained to my parents that they believed I might have something called borderline personality disorder, which at the time, I don't think any of us in my family really knew really what it was, other than I know we heard it and thought, oh, that's serious. That's a big deal. But the doctors told me and my family that they don't typically diagnose BPD under the age of 18 because some of the symptoms that individuals with BPD experience, such as like, mood swings or like tumultuous emotions and unstable relationships or having this unclear identity or sense of self, are also experienced by teenagers, in that they thought that I might grow out of it, and they just kind of left it at that. And so I don't even think that information stuck. I actually don't think they even explained that those symptoms were what they were talking about. All they said is a lot of people grow out of it. You're good, basically. So after I was discharged and I graduated from the outpatient program that I transitioned to after that time, I believed that I was done with feeling bad. I was done with my struggles. I had gotten help. I feel like a lot of times things end at like, it gets better, you'll get help, but what does that help look like? How can we access that help? These are things that are so important to know, and I didn't have that foundational structure set up. And now I know that my mental health is something I have to maintain. It's sort of like if you work hard to get abs, and if you stop working out, those abs will go away. My mental health is something that I have to give like attention to and work towards every day, but I didn't at the time. And so I fell quickly back into this place that I was at prior to my hospitalization. And it was very frustrating, but I had a conversation with my parents, and we decided it would be best if I went to a residential treatment center. So I went to a residential treatment center in Utah, where I spent the entirety of my 8th grade year. I actually graduated 10 months to the day that I was admitted, which I always think is a little fun. But I attended group therapy every day and had individual therapy multiple times a week. I was in this community of other people who were healing and had gone through similar things that I had and felt the same way, or at least similarly. And it felt really eye-opening, and like I had this sense of belonging I hadn't had previously. And when I graduated, I felt happy in a way that I never had. I felt like I was capable of being loved, and like maybe I wasn't a burden. I thought that the people who said they cared about me might be telling the truth, even though I often had thought that they'd been lying or pitying me or something like that. But returning to the real world was a huge shock. I went from a treatment center of only 32 girls to a freshman class of 1,200 kids. And at my residential treatment center, we weren't allowed to have cell phones or iPods or access to the internet. And I left when flip phones had been the hot thing, and I had like a ringback tone and whatnot. And I returned and iPhones were there, and everything, the world had moved on in a way that I had been changing myself, but I was in one place. And it was a really hard transition. And even though I'd been allowed to write certain approved friends that, supported my recovery while I was in treatment, it was difficult maintaining friendships via snail mail. It's hard to get a 13-year-old to write anything particularly heartfelt or prolific in a letter. And a lot of times I'd wait weeks for like, school is fun, how are you, love you, XOXO. And even though that was nice, when I left, I felt like there was this disconnect between the friendships. I needed to catch up. But at the same time, I didn't understand that I needed to put in the work to get to know those people, to foster those friendships. I just felt like I am being abandoned. Like no one, I got home and it was really cool for a few weeks because I dropped off the face of the planet for all of 8th grade and then I reappeared. But then life settled back to normal. And when I didn't have this like very solid group of friends, or immediately have some like spectacular relationship, or if I wasn't invited to the cool parties, I felt like it confirmed all my worst fears, that I was a burden, forgettable, going to be abandoned, that I was unlovable, that I annoyed everyone. And I just went back to what was comfortable for me because of that. I started engaging with all the harmful behaviors I'd done before treatment. And that was really hard because I graduated fully believing once again that I would never struggle with my mental health again. And if I did, that I would not engage in any negative behaviors. And I think I had that belief that many people seem to have, that recovery is this straight line and you enter recovery and things are great forever. And I so wish that was true, but many of us, it will be a little bit up and down, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you're not working on it. It's completely fine. But I didn't know that at the time. And it just felt like I was in this cycle of feeling like everything was perfect, but then everything was horrible and awful and like terrible. And it was exhausting swinging on that pendulum. And I ended up being hospitalized again, and it was just frustrating. And I knew that I just didn't understand why, And so I transferred to a school of only 120 kids, and that helped a lot, but I continued to struggle with my mental health. And I didn't understand why I reacted so strongly to situations that others didn't even seem fazed by, or why it took so long for my emotions to return to baseline after the triggering event was resolved, why I couldn't maintain friendships or relationships, and I was always seemingly having these blowout fights and hating someone, or they were hating me. I constantly feared I was going to be abandoned, and that aching emptiness I'd started feeling when I was young just like grew and grew, and I just couldn't identify what was going on. I could see the destruction and the disruption these things were causing in my life, but I didn't know why they were happening or figure out how to stop it. But I made it work, I found ways to cope in a way that made things bearable but not good. And, I graduated high school. I went on to the University of Michigan. I wasn't awful, but I wasn't good. And I just kind of thought that maybe that's how I was wired, that maybe I wasn't capable of feeling any better, that the myth feeling was like my peak. And I just tried to accept that. But in 2018, before I entered my first year of grad school at the University of California, Riverside, a friend mentioned when I was venting to her that she had a friend who felt a lot like me, and that friend had been diagnosed with BPD, and had I ever heard of it? And until that moment, I hadn't ever thought about the thing that my doctors had said during my first hospitalization. I don't think it even registered in my brain. I left there thinking I have depression and anxiety, and BPD, that speculated diagnosis, didn't even click. But when she said that, I was like, wait a second, this is familiar. It unlocked a memory for me. So I Googled BPD and I looked up the symptoms, and I was like, what? This is me. I have never what? And up until that point, I really believed that I was like the only one in the world feeling these things. And it was so isolating and exhausting and horrible. And so reading that was like, just like such an amazing feeling of like, whoa, it's not like I want to feel these things, and I don't want anyone else to have to experience them either. But how amazing is it to know that like I'm not broken and like this is something that happens. So I made an appointment once I got to grad school only a few weeks later to see a psychiatrist, and I was officially diagnosed with borderline personality disorder at age 23, a full 10 years after I was initially speculated to have it. And while I know a lot, or some people can feel that receiving a diagnosis is limiting or harmful or scary, my experience was not that. I felt like getting my diagnosis was freeing. I felt like it showed me that I wasn't alone in the world, and it gave me hope that I could get better and that I wasn't doomed. And it allowed me to recognize all these detrimental patterns I'd been aware of and I'd been engaging in, and I didn't even like know that I'd been doing that. And with that awareness, I was able to like work towards not engaging in those harmful behaviors and patterns. And rather than addressing the peripheral symptoms I was experiencing as a result of my BPD, I was finally able to address the root cause of these things instead of playing this like exhausting game of like, mental illness whack-a-mole where I dealt with one thing and something else popped up all the time. And this allowed me to grow and heal in a way that I'd never been able to previously. And I felt hopeful. And that was a very rare feeling for me. And I think that I had kind of given up on feeling any better prior to that point. But as I searched for movies or shows or books or anything created about or by people with BPD, it became clear there's a very small amount of representation of BPD in the media. I noticed this very large gap between my experiences as someone who lives with BPD and the way that I saw BPD portrayed in books and films and media as a whole. I understand that everyone's experiences are different, but the way that I saw things like BPD being portrayed was mainly in a really stigmatized and what felt like an icky like way. And I even saw this through Google searches. I Googled borderline personality disorder, and the suggested searches came up with, can people with BPD really love? Or are borderlines abusive? Or are people with BPD dangerous? And I was hurt and startled, and it put into perspective not only how misunderstood BPD is as a whole, but the ways that people might view me or assumptions they make about me once they discover my diagnosis. And that was really hurtful, and it was really difficult as someone who struggles with black and white thinking and feeling like things are either amazing or awful, to try and reckon with this idea that this thing that I saw as such a positive step in my life, getting this diagnosis, was something that other people viewed so negatively. How can those coexist? And as a writer, I was in grad school for creative nonfiction writing. I wanted to read books about my experience. And when I Googled books about BPD, I found a lot of books that offered advice on how to have a relationship with or support or deal with those who have BPD. And I felt so frustrated by that. Where were the books about people who have BPD written by people with BPD? There were a few, and I'm really grateful for those, but there's a staggering difference in the content or like the amount of that. And I really resent this idea of dealing with someone with BPD or another mental illness. I don't know why we should ever have to be dealt with. Isn't every relationship built on learning how to best support and communicate with one another regardless of mental illness? You don't deal with someone, you figure out like how to communicate and how to love them and support them, and they do the same for you. And that's what everything is, regardless of the struggle. And so being in grad school for creative writing, I decided to write a book about my experiences as someone who lives with BPD, a book that I wished that could have existed when I was diagnosed. One that not only shares the hard or bad parts of living with mental illness like BPD, but the good and all the in-betweens without all the fear-mongering or misbetrayals and the stigma that I saw in other texts. And I hoped that by telling my story, others who live with BPD or anxiety or depression, or even just struggle to find their place in the world or feel like they understand who they are, would see glimmers of their own experiences in mine and feel less alone. And so only 3 years later, The Way She Feels made its way into the world. And my wish for its publication was that I could help just one person. I thought, okay, I'm being super vulnerable and this is scary, but if I can just get one person, even if I don't know about it, who feels like I've made a positive impact on their life and made them feel a little less alone, like every bit of fear and like vulnerability, feeling will be worth it. And now my book is approaching its 1-year anniversary, and my wish to help just one person has come true over and over and over again. And it's been astounding to know that just by sharing how my life has helped others feel something like that. I didn't know that just like existing the way that I have could have such a positive effect on people. And that's been wild, knowing that for so long I viewed myself as worthless. And now I'm like, what? But I recently received an email that read, "Thank you for being brave enough to share your experiences, to put into words the thoughts that I haven't even let myself acknowledge internally before. Borderline doesn't feel as much like a curse being put on me or a death sentence. I don't feel like defective goods or a freak anymore. I feel hope that I can get better. I can change for the better. So thank you so much for making me feel human." And that is why representation is so important. And of course, BPD, like anything else, is not one size fits all. The way that I experience borderline personality disorder and my story might look extremely different than another person who shares my same diagnosis. And while I can't speak for anyone's experience but my own, I hope that sharing my story helps combat stigma and contributes to humanizing the way that we as a society view BPD and mental illness. And that it becomes clear that even if you have, a label or a diagnosis and you fit a certain diagnostic criteria, you are a person. You have likes and dislikes, and it's not like you can read the DSM and see like, oh, that's them. You're just someone who's dealing with something. Like, we all are dealing with something, whether it's BPD or diabetes or cancer or anything. So I'm 26 now, and I am happier than I've ever been. And that isn't to say that every day is easy or that getting diagnosed with BPD has cured me of the feelings that I've been reckoning with my whole life. But, while some people might fully recover and in the way that they never experience symptoms again once they seek treatment or find that right medication or whatever works for that person, that is not my experience, at least at this time. And I have very much accepted the fact that I might always have symptoms of BPD or other like anxiety, depression, whatever it is. But I now have the tools to be able to handle those in a way that they don't have to overtake my life. And I have a support system, and I know that I will make my way through those bad moments. And even if I have a thought that I know is kind of rooted in my BPD, such as, if someone doesn't text me back and I think, oh, I'm being abandoned, they hate me. I also have a part of myself that pops up and says, hey, I don't think that's true. I think we're like reading into it. And I can talk myself down from that ledge. Even if I still feel that fear, I know that I don't have to give it as much power. So, just like we all have to drink water and eat and sleep and go to the bathroom to take care of ourselves, I have additional basic needs like taking medication and going to therapy and using my coping skills and regularly checking in with myself on how I'm feeling. Is there something I've been overlooking? Do I just want to feel good and I'm ignoring that maybe there's like the inklings that I'm not? But these are the things that I do, and I don't feel like they're a burden. I don't feel like they're a heavy weight to carry. These are the things that allow me to live the happy and fulfilling life that I do. And if I have to swallow a pill in the morning to do that, or if I have to chat with a therapist that makes me feel very valid and seen, I will happily do so. And so, yes, I have BPD, and that is something that I wish I knew sooner, because I really believe that it would have allowed me access to treatment in the ways that I needed. I was, accessing therapy and whatnot, but I wasn't targeting the right thing. And it's just been so amazing to have that diagnosis and grow. And while I do have BPD and I, might always struggle with these things, I'm also a relatively normal person living a normal life, whatever normal means. And, I do my best to work with the cards that I've been dealt, just like everyone else is, neurotypical or otherwise. And, I'm doing my best like everyone else is. I'm human. And I am just immeasurably grateful to have had the opportunity to share my story in my book and at events like these, but also to have received the care and the access and the treatment that I have. And it's just so amazing to be able to give back to an organization that is allowing others to find that similar feeling of hope and community, because it makes all the difference. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Courtney. That was incredible. We are so glad you joined us. I'd like to turn it over to Lisa Johnson now for some comments. Lisa, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
I want to make sure, good morning, everyone. I want to make sure that you have plenty of time to submit questions to our featured speaker, Courtney Cook. So I'm just going to say one thing that has been on my mind since reading her wonderful book, The Way She Feels. So I noticed that the book opens with a trigger warning. And I think that this was wise and generous to alert readers that some scenes might be difficult to read, that they might be more explicitly detailed in, for example, scenes of self-harm than some readers would be comfortable encountering. And I can recall, as the author of Girl in Need of a Tourniquet, also about my experience with BPD that came out in 2010. A couple of friends deciding that they didn't want to read it or had to stop at a certain point or had to take breaks. And I remember thinking, gosh, if I could live through it, surely you could live through reading about it. So I want to kind of flip the idea of the trigger warning on its head right now. Again, even though I think it's wise and generous in this book and others to include them, but I want to talk about what is the positive effect of writing scenes that describe dysregulation or compulsive thinking or obsessive feelings about someone else. Or in the particular case of Courtney's amazing graphic memoir, I'll just vaguely describe it as hair pulling patterns, compulsive patterns. So I want to talk about why it is so important to have scenes like that. We need the trigger warnings, but I think we also need to welcome the detailed, honest disclosure of some of our most difficult moments. And it means being very exposed and vulnerable as an author. Sometimes I think critics perceive those sorts of scenes as a kind of, I remember a reviewer of a different book, not mine or Courtney's, calling a certain scene like flaunting disorder. And I really take issue with that, because what I think the positive cultural work is of creating and publishing scenes like that is that it normalizes dysregulation. So it takes what Courtney or I or other authors or what you in the audience may have experienced as embarrassing, shameful moments that we feel maybe no one else in the world does, and we would be so mortified if other people knew about it. I was so moved in the moment of Courtney's memoir where she reflected on being so relieved in a certain relationship not to have written about the tweezing, the hair pulling, just so glad that she hadn't made that information available, because it can be used as ammunition against you in a relationship or in interactions with the public. But the other thing that it does is that it helps everybody else who has had those same kinds of experiences feel less abnormal. It is a community building gesture, and it is a destigmatizing gesture. And so I'm so grateful for people who will make that generous gift of their most vulnerable moments to bring us all together so that we don't have those feelings of isolation or being uniquely different in ways that require us to hide our difficulties, that we can kind of bring it into the light, not to trivialize, but to make it not such a big deal. Of course, it is a big deal, but to make it something that can be named and talked about and claimed. So I just want to express gratitude and to frame her work as improving the cultural literacy about not only BPD, but specifically the symptoms related to emotional dysregulation. So thank you, Courtney Cook, for doing that and for being with us here today. I'm going to open the floor now to a Q&A. So I'm going to pop over and see if there are questions for you here. Okay, first question. This is funny. I have definitely gotten this question too. I want to hear your answer. Did your parents read the book, and what was that like?
Yes, so I am really lucky to have just like my parents be my number one fans. It feels like they would get foam fingers that say like, my daughter's a writer, she's number one. If they could, maybe they will now after I say this, to like make fun of, like, you know, poke fun at me and to show their support. But I have a super open relationship with my parents. We are really, really close. And I think that's the result of having attended so much family therapy over the years. And I did have some, I guess, you know, just like feelings of maybe embarrassment or shame or anything when I'm being vulnerable in the way that I am in the text. It can be kind of awkward, right? To have your parents know like every intimate detail of your life, especially about topics that you probably wouldn't typically share with them, such as like romance or whatever. But I have received nothing but support from them, and I am so grateful for that. My mom is a writer and has published many books herself, and so it was really, really cool to have watched her publish her books as I grew up and like attend her book release parties and think, oh, one day I'm going to do this, and like one day I'm going to have a book, and dream of that. And then when I, you know, had my launch party for my book, it was held over Zoom, but at the same bookstore that I attended her first book's launch. It's just so cool. And I know that prior to beginning, like, you know, when I was first diagnosed, I did have my parents express some hesitation toward me being so open about my diagnosis because they didn't want me to be judged or treated differently. And I know that came from the place of them wanting to, like, you know, take care of me and to make sure I was safe. And they know that I am very vulnerable to feeling hurt, and they don't want me to, but they also saw how important it was to me for me to share my story and to try and combat that stigma by being open. And I think they realized, oh, like the exact thing that we're worried about happening is what she's trying to push back against. And like that we can wholeheartedly get behind. So any of their initial hesitation just came from, I know it came from this place of like, I deeply love you and I want you to feel okay. And I'll do anything to help you get there. So yeah, they both read it, and they're both really supportive.
That's great. Thank you. And how wonderful to have such a supportive family, and kudos to your parents.
I am so lucky.
Yes. Are you still in therapy? What type of mental health treatments have been most effective for you? For example, DBT, CBT, etc.
Yes, so I'm currently on the hunt for a new therapist. I switched insurance providers recently, and that, you know, just things change. But I have tried what I really like, every type of therapy under the sun. I have done DBT, CBT, sand tray therapy. I've done ketamine assisted therapy. I have done like gongs that are healing, like truly anything in the pursuit of feeling better. I have responded most positively to DBT as it was created to specifically treat BPD. And I have also really found a lot of solace in I think it's called neurofeedback, or it's like this idea that you can kind of rewire the like situations in your brain, and you can, you know, learn how to have different thought patterns and how to, like, you know, react differently over time by kind of like making small adjustments through. And I was mainly targeting that in ketamine assisted therapy. And I had just the most amazing therapist, Jessica, at that time. And I just am so appreciative of the work we did together. And I unfortunately had to stop seeing her when I moved from California to Chicago because, you know, that's how she's licensed there and I live here. But it was just such a fruitful relationship with her. And I just am so grateful for the work we did together. And I've taken that with me. So am I still in therapy? Kind of, because I'm just on the hunt for a new one, but I am eagerly waiting when I find that right match, because as I've found, you really have to connect with your therapist to be able to do the work you need to do. And I don't want to just go to anyone. I want to make sure that I am getting the most bang for my buck type of thing.
Wonderful. Paula, I see that we are at 9:59. Are we closing out at 10 for this panel, or would you like me to keep going with the Q&A?
Thank you so much. We could do like one more minute. It's 9:59. We could do 1 or 2 more minutes.
Okay. Okay, this is an interesting question that kind of probes the point that I made about writing specific scenes about self-harm. When you read or hear specific details of other people's self-harm, do you ever find it to be triggering for you, as in urges to engage in self-harm yourself? So how does that work for you, Courtney?
I don't feel the triggering like urge as I did when I was younger and I was actively engaging in self-harm, and it was still very close to home and like something that I remembered very clearly. I do, as Lisa mentioned, struggle with picking at my skin and pulling at my hair, or these things called Dermatillomania and Trichotillomania, if you want to be fancy in the name. But that's a form of hurting myself in some way, but it doesn't have the same connotation to me. It's a like anxiety thing. It's somehow different. So when I write these scenes about self-harm now, or when I read others, even if I feel kind of that like very weird type of nostalgia of like, oh, I remember when that helped, or like I remember how that felt, it's so clouded by years and years of not engaging with it and knowing that it didn't actually benefit me, that I'm able to separate myself from any of that, like, ooh, and just be like, I can't, like, I'd never want to go back to that place. And so I just have to not give that any merit type of thing. I'm like, nope, no, we're not for me, never mind.
That's great. I think that's a good note to end on. Paula, I'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank Courtney for being with us today. You are a friend of Emotions Matter, and we hope to continue to see you again because you're doing incredible work to make people feel safe and comfortable talking about this disorder. By putting yourself out there, you're creating spaces for people to engage. And so we appreciate your work at Emotions Matter. If you have questions for Courtney that she was not able to address, feel free to email them to us and we will try to get them to her or make connections for you. I invite you at this time to go to our next panels. We have panel 1, challenges exploring BPD treatments. and understanding pathways to care. And then panel 2 is on advocacy in the family. And so we're going to close out our plenary session, and we welcome you to go hop into our panel 1 and panel 2 for the day. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.